Welcome to The Hypnotist, the show that gives you inside access to cutting-edge hypnosis with real clients facing genuine issues. Brought to you by the hypnotherapist demanded by celebrities, CEOs, and even royalty, Adam Cox. These recordings took place live from Adam's clinic in London's world-famous Harley Street. This podcast features powerful hypnosis, so do not listen while driving or operating machinery. This recording is not suitable for those with epilepsy or severe mental health issues. So, get yourself comfortable and enjoy today's episode of The Hypnotist.
Hi everyone, it's Adam here, and in this episode of The Hypnotist, I'm going to be sharing a talk I did at the New Zealand Hypnosis Conference, and it's on a topic that I find fascinating, which is the fourth dimension. And the fourth dimension is this idea that there is a dimension beyond the third dimension. And the thing that makes the fourth dimension different from the third dimension is that time is not linear. It doesn't just move in a sequential order, and that perception isn't limited to one point of perception, which for a human in the third dimension is normally our senses from our physical location. And the reason I find it quite fascinating is that it's almost certain that because we live in a three-dimensional reality, we will never actually experience the fourth dimension. I think the closest we're ever going to get to it is virtual reality in metaverses, where these VR headsets will enable us to do things like speed up time, slow down time, rewind, and it will feel like the fourth dimension, even though we're still in the three dimension experiencing an interface with something that acts like the fourth dimension. And that's fascinating because I love technology. But the other thing I love is hypnosis. And I think that hypnosis is the interface to the imagination. And if you think of the imagination and the fourth dimension as two separate Venn diagrams, I think they overlap quite a lot, because there are things that you can easily do in your imagination that is simply impossible in a three-dimensional reality. You can go backwards and forwards in time, and you can take a different perception. And these are some of the things that make the fourth dimension unique. So you're going to be hearing this talk, and this talk was, I'm in London, so it was a virtual presentation, and it has 3 different thought experiments that are like short hypnosis sessions as a part of this talk. It is very, very similar to a talk that I did perhaps a month or 2 ago for the Hypnosis Education Association conference. So if you've heard that one, probably isn't worth you listening to this one again, just because they are very similar. But if you find this interesting, let me know in the comments, and I'll share more of these kind of stuff, the more educational stuff. And if you don't, let me know as well, and I will stick to doing hypnosis sessions. But for now, it's not really a hypnosis session. It's more of an education seminar, lasts about an hour. Relax, enjoy. If you find it useful, keep listening. And if you don't, just skip to one of the normal hypnosis ones. So enjoy, and hopefully you learn something. Take care. Hello, everyone. How is everyone there? Excellent. So we're going to be talking about call it a weird or strange kind of topic, the fourth dimension. Any questions that you have, write them down, and we can very much talk about them at the end, because I want to make this kind of useful for you, a bit of a creative thought experiment kind of journey, really. Thank you for the lovely introduction. For those that don't know about me, I have a podcast called The Hypnotist, and I share real hypnosis sessions with real clients, protecting confidentiality, and I love doing it. I've done, I think, about 1,500 different hypnosis sessions over about 4 or 5 years. And when you do that many, you're constantly looking for inspiration. So I get inspiration from movies and poetry and stories and all kinds of things. And some of the topics that I become interested in is kind of science fiction and time travel and that kind of stuff. So this is going to be lots of kind of thought experiments and lots of kind of adventures in your imagination is really what this is all about. So some of you will be familiar with Einstein, and Einstein created the general theory of relativity, but a lot of people don't know where he got that from. Just raise your hand if you're familiar with his original thought experiment. Couple of you. So what we're going to do is we're going to recreate this thought experiment to some extent. So it's always good to start with a little bit of kind of internal meditation or thought experiment. So all I want you to do is to take a nice deep breath in, and on the outward breath, just close your eyes. That's it. As you breathe in a feeling of resourcefulness. And as you exhale, just release any tension. That's it. And I want you to use the power of your imagination to imagine that you're on planet Earth with an identical twin. And just imagine they're exactly your age, genetically identical to you, but they're not you. You are you, and they are them. Look at the details. It's almost like looking into a mirror, but it's your identical twin. And then I want you to imagine a beam of light. And that beam of light starts where you are on Earth and goes up into space. And I want you to use the power of your imagination to imagine climbing onto that beam of light and almost riding it like it's a bike. Imagine leaving Earth's orbit, and just imagine leaving the solar system, going past the asteroid belt, planets, leaving our solar system and going throughout the Milky Way. And for the sake of this thought experiment, I want you to imagine that you're not traveling at the speed of light. You are traveling at 99.9% of the speed of light. And because you're going so fast, you can cover vast distances. I want you to imagine what it would be like to explore the Milky Way and then venture out into different galaxies. I want you to see nebulas, the birth of a star. I want you to see comets, huge planets with rings and multiple moons, and continue way, way throughout the universe, seeing black holes off into the distance. And I want you to imagine that you're returning back to Earth. As you return back to Earth, I want you to notice, as you touch back in the same location on that beam of light, what for you has been maybe weeks, has been a different time for your identical twin. And I want you to see that your identical twin is perhaps 40 or 50 or 60 years older. And just feel the realization that time is relative and is different for you and your identical twin. But just imagine that twin is so much older and has experienced so much, but shares your genetics. And just allow that identical twin to reveal some kind of deep insight, perhaps a life lesson that you really need to know, but is coming from someone that looks just like you, but perhaps 60 years ahead. And when you've listened to that deep insight, just open your eyes, feel back here in the present, and just get a sense that this thought experiment is not a million miles away from what Einstein did. Einstein created an idea of traveling on a beam of light just in his imagination. But it's worth appreciating that what happened only in his imagination led to one of the most profound theories in the laws of physics in our actual reality. that we can harvest insights and resources from our imagination and bring them back into the real world. So we're going to be talking a bit about dimensions, because the fourth dimension, I believe, is a fantastic metaphor to start thinking about the imagination. So if we were to think about 2 dimensions, for example, 2 dimensions, you could think of that as a flat surface. So here I am in my 3-dimensional reality in London, you're over there in your 3-dimensional reality in New Zealand, and yet we're interacting through a 2-dimensional screen. And the difference between these dimensions is quite helpful to start with 2 dimensions to get to 3, so we can start really appreciating what is the 4th dimension. So if you think of a 2-dimension, generally it's a flat surface. So it could be a painting, it could be a TV screen, it could be the paper in front of you. But that's a 2-dimensional surface. 3-dimension is your reality, and that reality is a 3-dimensional space. And in that 3-dimensional space, you can perceive depth and solid forms, and generally movement goes up and down, left and right, and time moves in a linear way. It always goes forward. And in the 4th dimension, it has an extra dimension, and that dimension, and there's very complex physics around this, but for the purpose of this talk, if we just look at 2 key things, and that is time is not linear in the 4th dimension. Time can go forwards, time can go back, time can come up and down. It doesn't have to go forward. So when you hear things like time marches on and you know, time is relentless, that is time described in a 3-dimensional reality. In a 4th dimensional reality, it doesn't. Time is fluid. The second key difference that's worth focusing on for this is perception. In a 3-dimensional perception, you can only ever take one perception. Now, you can get glimpses of multiple perceptions. Let's say that you catch yourself in a reflection. You might very briefly entertain 2 different perceptions rapidly, but only one at a time. You go from your perception to the new perception. In the 4th dimension, there's this idea that you can hold multiple perceptions simultaneously. You can see the outside of the box and also appreciate what's in the box. And we'll get to this kind of idea of Schrodinger's cat later. But that's a useful way to kind of get some value from this session, is to think of time and perception as the 2 key things that we focus on. Now, these drawings here, or these images here, are something known as pentacorons. Pentacorons are 4-dimensional triangles. So if you think of a 2-dimension as a triangle, a 3-dimensional version of a triangle is called a tetrahedron. And it's kind of like a pyramid with a triangular base, if that makes sense. And for a lot of people, you know, that's a fairly easy thing to imagine. You know, the Grand Pyramids have a square base, but most people get the idea of a 3-dimensional triangle being a pyramid. A pentacoron is a 4-dimensional triangle. And what makes it 4-dimensional is effectively that it is a shape in flux. So these images here, and I'm fascinated by 4-dimensional shapes. My house is filled with images like this. If you look at the image in the middle there, what you'll see is that the image on the top is not exactly the same as the reflection. And why that's interesting is that this is an AI-generated image, and the AI understanding of 4-dimensional shapes knew that it doesn't have to be the same, that actually the reflection doesn't have to be the same as the surface. So that starts to give us an idea of these. Now, if you think of how could you have an image of a 4-dimensional shape, well, you can, because it's possible for us to have a 3-dimensional image on a 2-dimensional surface. You've all drawn a cube before. You've all drawn a pyramid, for example. This is just a 2-dimensional representation of a 4-dimensional shape. The reason I show this is because it's a very good vehicle to start introducing clients to this idea of 4 dimensions by actually having something they understand in 3 dimensions and then bridging that to a 4-dimensional reality. So the uniqueness of the 4th dimension comes down to time is dynamic and perception is not limited to a single point. So a helpful metaphor, if you think of our 3-dimensional reality, it's like a book, but the pages can only go forward. Once today is gone, we don't get it back. And that would be like reading a book and you can't ever turn the page back. Once the page is gone, it's gone. The four-dimensional representation of a book would be to jump to any line on the book, any page of the book instantly, and to know all of the content in the book immediately. You know the beginning, the middle, and the end all at exactly the same time. So 4 dimensions is fluid, and it also has the possibility of multiple realities, so that the content of a 3-dimensional book stays the same. If you buy the book, even if you haven't read it, it's still the same. A 4-dimensional book could have multiple different stories. It could have multiple different endings, if that makes sense. It's always in a state of flux. And these could be quite helpful metaphors, which we'll get to later. In essence, in the 4th dimension, time and space has a fabric. It can be navigated. It isn't static. And why I think this is important comes to this idea of how we can harness the idea of 4th dimensional properties. Before we get to that, it's worth asking the question, though, can we experience the 4th dimension? And the answer to that is highly likely to be no. We'll never be able to experience the 4th dimension in the actual 4th dimension. And a useful way to think about that, if you're a 2-dimensional character in a comic strip or a cartoon, jumping out into the 3-dimensional world, you wouldn't even, like, your physics wouldn't exist in that space, if that makes sense. In the same way that we, being 3-dimensional entities, we couldn't comprehend being in a 4-dimensional space, both in terms of perception and all these kind of things. Like a fish can't exist on land, for example. Another really useful way of thinking about can we exist in a time of multiple times is something called the grandfather's paradox. The grandfather paradox is this idea that if it was possible to navigate through time, then the grandfather paradox says, well, what if you went back in time and killed your grandfather? But the paradox being that if you could go back in time and kill your grandfather, then you would never have been born in order to go back in time and kill your grandfather. So there is kind of like logical things that give us this idea that we'll never actually be able to experience the 4th dimension. Stephen Hawking did something quite funny. He hosted a party for time travelers. I don't know if anyone's seen this story, but he kind of had this party, and the thing was only time travelers can attend this party. But of course, he announced it after the party had finished, with the basis being that time travelers would have known that the party was taking place and therefore could have attended. But of course, nobody turned up. So there is kind of anecdotal evidence, at least, that this idea of time travel itself isn't actually a possible thing. But it doesn't have to be, because we as hypnotists have something very, very similar to the 4th dimension. So we're going to do another quick thought experiment here. All I want you to do, take a nice deep breath in. On the outward breath, close your eyes. And all I want you to do is remember where you were living when you were 10 years old. And maybe it was an apartment, and maybe it was a house, but I want you to remember the building from the outside. And all I want you to do, for the purpose of this thought experiment, is to count how many doors are in the place where you used to live when you were 10 years old. So the front door counts and the back door counts. Cupboard doors don't count, but every door to a room counts. And all I want you to do is to count how many doors. Now, nobody intuitively knows how many doors are in the house that they were living in when they were 10 years old. But just have a little wander around and then open your eyes when you've come to that right number. Now, what you may have done there, as most people tend to do, is access a memory and navigate that memory as if it's a 3-dimensional realm. So you may have walked through the front door and looked to the left and the right and wandered around that particular house or apartment and counted doors. And in reality, it may have taken maybe 2 or 3 minutes to count the amount of doors in that home. But in your imagination, you were able to do it in maybe 10 seconds or so. So it gives us an idea that there is time distortion when we went back to that memory. Most people take a first-person perspective. They're seeing that home, that apartment in color, and then navigating around sometimes at the same height they were when they were actually living in that home. Now, for a lot of you, that home, that apartment, it doesn't even exist anymore. You may have not have seen it for many, many years, but in that moment, we had a glimpse of traveling through time and navigating a memory as if it was a three-dimensional space. So just raise your hand if you were able to count how many doors, or if you felt that you were able to wander around that home. Now, thanks for sharing that. That gives us an idea that it is possible for us to do something in our imagination that we definitely can't do in reality. Nobody has a time machine that can take you back to that home, but you were able to go around that home just in your imagination. So what we can say is that the Venn diagram of the fourth dimension and the imagination overlap to some extent. And that's really the purpose of this talk, to highlight that the imagination can be a very useful, or the fourth dimension could be a useful way of framing and thinking about your imagination to give us more tools and abilities as to how to actually use it. So if you think about when you're working with clients, for example, a lot of the time when you're working with clients that have trauma or have regret or have shame, quite often they spend a lot of time going back to a memory and reliving certain things. I've worked with quite a few clients with very severe PTSD, and they have flashbacks, and they jump back and they relive a moment as if it's happening in the present, and they take a first-person perspective and they re-experience that. If you think of grief, for a lot of the time, that's thinking back to a moment and then comparing what was with what is now. A lot of these kind of things, a lot of the clients that I work with that have severe phobias, for example, they need their memory of times that they've suffered with anxiety in order to experience a belief system that they can't handle it in the present. So all of these things, clients are spending a lot of time in a place that doesn't exist in reality, but they're jumping back to the past. Some of your clients are going to be jumping into the future. A lot of anticipatory fear, for example, these what-if questions are teleporting into a moment that hasn't happened yet, and then dealing with the consequences as if it's happening in the moment. So if you think about a lot of anxiety, a lot of worry, a lot of preemptive risks, a lot of planning, is spending time not in the present, but in the future. Now that doesn't fit with our three-dimensional reality, but the emotion comes from spending time in a different place, and that place is a different time. So this element of where clients are spending their time anyway is in a different dimension. A lot of the time, some of you may have worked with people that have, let's say, fantasies or, delusions, or even call it wishful thinking, but they're spending a lot of time thinking about a reality that doesn't exist. And that could be entertaining thoughts of, if only, if only I'd have done that, then my life would be different. And therefore they're spending time in a reality as a result of a different decision. For example, regret quite often comes to that place of, well, if I didn't do that, then I'd be in this different place. So clients aren't only spending their time in the past in terms of regret and trauma and anxiety, or in the future with worry and anticipatory fear, but sometimes in actual different kind of realities. Now, not all of these are unuseful. If you think of, let's say, manifestation, for example. Does anyone use a vision board or have affirmations about their own futures? Just raise your hand so I can kind of get a sense. Few of you. Now, in many ways, that's what manifestation is. It's entertaining the idea of a reality that doesn't exist and then figuring out how to make that happen. So there's a lot of these things that are clearly not happening in a three-dimensional kind of terrain, but they are happening like that in our imaginations. All of us dream. Not everyone are aware of our dreams, but it's helpful to think of a dream as a way of exploring quite often different realities. Some of those realities may be similar to actual realities. It might be memories, things that have happened. But all of you have had dreams that could not happen in reality. You've had dreams where you've been flying. Some of you have had a dream of being in your school assembly naked, for example. Now, that definitely didn't happen in reality, but it happened in your dream. It happened in your imagination. So you're going back to a different reality and a different time, and you're doing that in your dream. And your dream is just a way of accessing the power of your imagination. But nobody believes for a moment that they actually teleported into a different reality or into a different time. It's just that this is happening through an imagination, and the dream happens to be the interface for that particular experience. Sometimes it's also useful to think of other perspectives. So, for example, to really have empathy or jealousy or, let's say, a projection or whatever it might be, quite often there is a perception of taking on someone else's perspective in order to feel that emotion. I remember a few months ago working with a client who had a very severe fear of being on live TV because they were worried that if they were on live TV and they got it wrong, then they're going to be judged harshly from the audience watching that TV. But in order to get to that place, they had to take on a different perspective. Literally yesterday, I was working with a client that was full-on rage at her husband, not based on what he was actually doing, but what she was imagining he was doing. And that meant that she had to take on a perspective that she wasn't in reality, but she had a first-person perspective that's teleporting into a different reality, a different perspective. So a lot of these things that are happening, but create real emotions or real problems in the reality that someone exists in. So what I want you to do is to entertain a possibility, and that is that your imagination is not a three-dimensional realm, but your imagination is a four-dimensional realm. So whether it's time traveling back in time or future pacing into the future, we definitely can't do that in our three-dimensional reality, and yet we do it intuitively and effortlessly in our imagination. That to experience things like trauma and PTSD, quite often you have to go back in time. To have anticipatory fear or hypervigilance, you have to exist in the future. Think of someone like J.K. Rowling or Walt Disney. They had to spend a lot of time existing in realities that didn't exist in order to come up with the level of ideas that they have. They were exploring those ideas and those universes as if they were real, and there can be value from that, but there can also be a lot of problems with that. So this idea that imagination is a four-dimensional realm gives, I think, a lot of possibility for hypnotherapists. I've heard it being said at various conferences that everything that there is to learn about hypnosis has already been learned. That all it is giving it different acronyms and different protocols, but effectively it's the same model in the same way. And I don't think that is true, because if we look at our imagination, the ability for our human mind to entertain things as a four-dimensional realm, then the very definition of it being a four-dimensional realm means that it is an infinite playground of possibility. There are literally no limitations to what you could do within that four-dimensional space. So let's jump forward to this bit. So if we were to think about, well, how do we harness this kind of four-dimensional realm? And, if we look at the imagination as a four-dimensional realm, I think as hypnotists, we are uniquely skilled to do that, because I would look at hypnosis as the interface, if that makes sense. I think that if we're never going to experience a true four-dimensional experience, there's only two things that are going to get close to that. And the first is the metaverse. So some of you have heard this phrase, but if you think of a digital world where you might access it through virtual reality headsets, you can also do four-dimensional things in that reality. You could teleport, you could go backwards and forwards in time, you could experience different realities, you could change your perception instantly. And therefore the interface for that four-dimensional realm might be a VR headset. And to manipulate and change that four-dimensional realm, then you might be a coder to change that. But I'm not a software developer, I'm not a coder, and I don't think you are either. But as hypnotists, we are uniquely placed to help clients interact with and navigate the second four-dimensional realm, which is the imagination. And so much of what happens in the imagination follows the principles of four-dimensional physics. Time is fluid, you can go backwards and forwards, you can take on different perceptions, and therefore hypnosis can be a toolkit for us to help clients navigating that particular realm. This is another four-dimensional object. What I quite like to do sometimes with clients is to use these kind of ideas of a four-dimensional object as a portal, as a way to get people, you're all familiar with pacing and leading. If you just jump straight into, imagine a four-dimensional reality, is a bit too far. So the bridge that I normally take people through is to take something they're already familiar with as a stepping stone into that four-dimensional realm where time travel and different perspectives feel very natural. Shapes is one of them. At the end of this, if we've got some time and if you're all interested, we can actually give you an experience of using a tesseract, which is a four-dimensional cube, as a way to explore and get to that kind of four-dimensional place in your imagination. I quite often use time travel as a metaphor for this kind of things. I think as a genre of movies, it's quite helpful. Everyone has their favorite time travel movie, for example. For some people, it's Back to the Future. For some people, it's kind of The Time Machine and things like that. But this idea of having a portal to travel backwards through time can help people have this idea. So it's an evolution. It's a different way of accessing things like timeline and regression, but in a way that can kind of get people into that particular place, if that makes sense. So I quite like using time travel and, let's say, multiverse or simultaneous or multiple realities to kind of get them into that place where a change can take place. So if we think of the time element, as hypnotists and hypnotherapists, we're using this a lot intuitively anyway, without really thinking about your working in four-dimensional physics. If you've ever used regression with a client, then effectively you're taking them back to a different moment. Now, that might be a first-person perspective or a third-person perspective, but you're taking them back to a time. And that might be regression to a cause of a problem. It might be to a past life if they kind of like that kind of idea, or it could be to resource states. But whenever you're using regression, that's already navigating this kind of idea of time is fluid within the imagination. If you're getting them to relive a particular moment that might be highly resourceful, maybe to anchor a resource state, or to disassociate from an unresourceful state, again, there's this idea of you're teleporting into a different point in time. Like, we know when we do a lot of hypnosis, there is time distortion. There is this kind of idea of things happen quicker or slower, and that kind of adds to the experience for the client. But a lot of these techniques that seem to be very effective do utilize the manipulation of time. So that might be a lot of anxiety, for example, requires rapid inner dialogue. I'm sure a few of you have used like the rewind technique for phobias, for example. A lot of these things are dealing with principles of time as if it's fluid. If you can rewind time and pause time, then it clearly can't be linear within the imagination. So a lot of timeline techniques, for example, have this idea of imagining time has a particular sequence, and if you go back in time and update some kind of memory or meaning, then it ripples through time all the way up to the present. And I know a lot of you have worked with clients. You go to the point where a phobia was caused or there was a moment of trauma, you give it a different meaning and a different perspective, and then suddenly that really intense trauma disappears rapidly, very, very quickly. Future pacing is also, in my mind, you're taking them to a future that doesn't exist yet. And that element that doesn't exist yet is the future that they could have once the change takes place. So post-hypnotic suggestions, pseudo-orientation in time, future pacing, this is all things that are based, I believe, on the presupposition that imagination is a four-dimensional realm. If you think about some of the big scandals in the 1980s, for example, around therapy, a lot of well-meaning, I would say, psychodynamic, psychoanalytic therapists had the presupposition that if someone was troubled in the present, it's because there was some kind of abuse in childhood. That was an unconscious belief that the therapist had, and because they had that belief with such intensity, as hypnotherapists, we understand that they probably influenced their clients to develop false memory syndromes, things like their tonality and leading questions led them to update a moment of their past as if it was true. Now, those false memory syndromes meant that, certain people went to jail for child abuse that never actually committed child abuse. But if you can impart and implant a devastating false memory, which I think is very disempowering, then it stands to reason that you could also put memories in there which are very useful and very empowering and very helpful for clients. But that's only possible if you believe that you can go back in time and change things. So also the element of perspective, I think most of you probably use the submodality shifts of kind of first person, third person kind of perspective. It doesn't obviously have to be a person. It can be a point of view that is just different from that kind of perspective. One thing, because a lot of what we're talking about here is just the idea that the imagination is a four-dimensional kind of realm. This is something that I think gives us a clue that we can do things uniquely different only if we take this idea that time is fluid and multiple perceptions are possible. So this is a protocol that I came up with inspired by a movie. Did anyone ever see the movie Tenet? It's a Chris Nolan film. He's the guy that did Inception. You're very solemn. I think there might be a hand or two going up there. But basically, the concept of this film is that there's this villain that can go back in time, and he's building a nuclear bomb. But one of the key premises of this particular movie is this idea of what's called a temporal pincer movement, that you can go backwards and forwards in time, and they meet in the middle. So if you think of military strategy, for example, a pincer movement is where you attack the enemy from two different flanks so that if they're defending on one side, they're not defending on the other. So it's a military maneuver. A temporal pincer movement is this idea of going to a point in time from two different directions. So I'm going to give an example because I think it might help as to where it can be useful. I was working with a lady. She was in, I think, her 50s or 60s, but she was raped when she was, I think, 14 or 15 years old. And she was raped in a cemetery. She was meeting an older boy that she thought she could trust, and clearly she couldn't. And she spent a lot of time thinking about that moment, from regret and what if and why did I do that and how stupid was I, and feeling guilt and shame and all this kind of stuff. But we did something quite unique with her, and that was to have 3 different versions of her. The version from the future that knew exactly what happened in the sequence that it happened half an hour after the event took place, and was going back to that moment with all of the knowledge of what happened. The version of her that hadn't experienced it yet, but knew what was about to happen because she'd been told by the other versions of her. And then the present, this kind of 50-year-old or 60-year-old lady, also going back to the moment, into that. So effectively it was an ambush. This 17-year-old boy had 3 different versions of the person that he was attacking, all going backwards and forwards. Now, there's several things happening here simultaneously. Every time the perception changed on that moment, you can call it a pattern interrupt. There was also associating into very empowered states, because in all 3 cases, she knew what was about to happen, and therefore there was no element of surprise. Also, she was very intentional. There was this idea of she couldn't change what actually happened, but she could certainly change how she thought about what happened. So this has this kind of idea of going backwards and forwards in time to a single moment to change history in that moment. And for her, it was very, very empowering, but it had this idea of doing things that could never happen in reality, but could happen if you look at time as fluid and perception as multifaceted, if that makes sense. So this is something I call a temporal pincer movement. So the perspective, I think, is a really important element of this. Now, a lot of the time, as therapists, we use things like association and disassociation, and I find that's the simplest way of doing it. Again, it has this premise that we can take a different perspective, that if we're dealing with a memory or a moment, it does not have to be a first-person perspective. Again, multiple perceptions is something that exists in the 4th dimension that doesn't exist in the 3 dimensions. So association and disassociation are 4-dimensional principles. To add some context to that, we can take a first-person perspective, which is being in your own body. And most of you, when you went back to that house when you were 10 years old, took a first-person perspective. Maybe just 1 or 2 of you took a third-person perspective and imagine like hovering around the house or seeing it from above. But most of you would have taken a first-person perspective. And that third person, so out of body, the second person, I tend to look at as the next significant person involved. So a quick example here as to how you might use this. I worked with a lady and she was in, I think, her 40s, but she had this deep, deep sense of guilt and shame because when she was 17 years old, she told a lie. And that lie was a fairly serious lie for a 17-year-old to be telling, but it was just a lie. And she kept on having these kind of thoughts that if she ran into these people, that, they're going to think she's horrible because of this lie that she told when she was an adolescent. In that particular case, the 4-dimensional principle here is taking the second-person perspective to go back to that other person that she's been worrying about, taking their perception and then imagining that she sees herself like she's someone else, telling them that thing that she told them was a lie, and then feeling from their perspective just how unbothered and unfazed they are because they've not even thought about it for 20 odd years. So there is an element of sometimes using different perspectives deliberately just to create a different, call it a reframe, call it a different perceptual change. So that element of second person can be really helpful. Sometimes specific third persons, this could be role models, a person of infinite wisdom, quite often I'll look for the resource state in the past or in a different context, but if it isn't there, the next question is, who is the person that has the resources, the way of dealing with things that you would like to deal with? And that quite often exists. And if they take on that first-person perspective of a specific third person, it gives them access to those resources. there is this idea of taking multiple people's perspectives, so like group psychology, group think, again, could be very helpful. And parts therapy, looking at, again, it's a model. Some of you might believe in this model of ego states and subpersonalities. But again, this is this idea of multiple different versions, but taking a first or third person perspective of those different versions of themselves. And another perspective, which I find very, very useful, is an alternate version of themselves. So we're going to talk about the multiverse in a little bit, but I think it's a very, very powerful model for clients to experience a different reality that doesn't feel possible for them in the moment. Some of you will be familiar with Schrodinger's cat. Perhaps this is a different kind of thought experiment. Again, it's designed to use this idea of kind of quantum psychology, this idea that multiple things exist at the same time. The original experiment, a lot of people say, well, Schrodinger's cat wouldn't work because you could hear the cat meowing, therefore you would know if the cat is dead or alive. The actual experiment involves this idea of a sealed metal chamber with a poison inside the metal chamber, and the cat may or may not knock over the poison, release the poison, and be dead. It may or may not be happening. So the paradox is that until you open this kind of sealed metal chamber, both possibilities exist. The cat is alive and the cat is dead simultaneously, and you only know that to be true when you actually open the box. Now, some people have this idea of, well, it definitely is one or the other, but from quantum science, it isn't that way, and that's why it's such an odd phenomenon, that actually there are certain things that change when the observer observes them. Some of you will have heard of this idea of quantum computing. Standard classical computing has this idea of zeros and ones, that actually the zeros and ones mean that it has to follow every single combination to get to a certain code. Quantum computing, which is going to radically change everything, entertains all the different possibilities simultaneously, and that's how the computing is so fast. The reason I say this is, again, this idea of different things that certainly aren't possible for us to do. And a lot of what we do in our imagination mirrors the three-dimensional world because those neural pathways are already built. But that isn't a limitation in our imagination. So if you think of there's a cat in a box, for example. Let's just say the cat is very quiet, so you don't know if there's a cat in there. The box is let's say it's not transparent. The only way you would know if there's a cat in the box is to open the box, assuming it wasn't making a sound. But in the fourth dimension, you would hold every single perception at the same time. You'd be able to see the box from the outside and the inside simultaneously. So you'd have access to all of the knowledge simultaneously. I know it's a weird concept because we're so used to seeing things in a linear way through time and only from one perspective. But in a four-dimensional reality, you could have multiple perspectives. Now, why this becomes useful is to help clients entertain all of the different possibilities from any particular scenario. So again, I'll share an example because I think it helps to kind of understand how to actually use this kind of stuff. I was working with a client about 3 months ago, and she had breast cancer. She had the MRI, but she hadn't had the results yet. And at that particular point in time, as most people would, they were worrying about what the future may be. And we did a session. It's actually on my podcast. I think it's called Quantum Healing. So you could check that out if you're interested. But we use this kind of metaphor of a black hole and the event horizon. And the reason I chose a black hole and the event horizon is because the event horizon beyond a black hole is the point that it is impossible to measure anything. Scientists simply don't know what goes on past the point of an event horizon. So therefore, we can hold this idea that beyond the event horizon, multiple possibilities exist. So we did this great induction where she imagined floating through the universe to find a black hole, to go past the event horizon. And beyond the event horizon, she was able to experience every single possible connotation of the MRI results that she hadn't had yet. So she could hear the news that the tumor had become benign, that it had disappeared, all of the different possibilities. Now, what I didn't want to do in that particular session is to give false hope and have her only consider the possibility that the tumor is benign or is disappeared. We also took her to the place that she hears undesirable news, but feels that she has the resilience to cope with that. So I would say that's a very, very useful, this idea of kind of multiple different possibilities is a great frame. If you've got clients worried about what the future may bring, you can actually get them to explore all of the possibilities, choose what it is, but it can help prepare them for either difficult news or whatever it might be. So this is an image on the right there of a black hole event horizon. It has this kind of weird shape because it's sucking everything in. So this kind of alternative realities. So in quantum theory, multiple realities exist simultaneously. We're not limited to a single reality. Now, different frames that you can use. You could use this kind of black hole idea and event horizon. Sometimes it's useful to introduce just a single alternative reality rather than infinite other realities because it's easier to understand. There was a great concept of a movie in the 1990s with Gwyneth Paltrow called Sliding Doors. Not a great film, but a great concept. This idea that in one reality, she catches the tube in London and sees one thing, and in another she doesn't. And that sliding doors is kind of a shift in the timeline. That can be very, very helpful to get your clients thinking of just two different realities. And that's very good, I feel, for addictions. There's the reality where they continue to smoke or take the drug, and there's the reality where they don't. And when you create just a fork in the road of two different timelines, it can become very, very easy for the client to see what will happen if they make a single decision either way, or if they can get to that place. So I would say if it is a singular behavior, a singular habit, a singular addiction, just a single parallel universe is really, really helpful. If, however, they simply don't know what they don't know, then this idea of a multiverse is very, very useful. And I was working with a client that had they were just very depressed. They felt a bit hopeless. They felt that they didn't have many opportunities. They had seen, I think it was Doctor Strange in the Multiverse. They had this kind of frame of what would it be like if there was like lots of different alternative realities. So we did this whole hypnosis session where there was infinite parallel universes. And the thing that remained the same is that their genetics was exactly the same. It was still them, but there was just infinite different versions of them. And the suggestion was, of all of these infinite realities, to go to the reality where they are living their best life. Now, the great thing about that suggestion is that it's whatever they define it to be. That might be with confidence, that might be, career success, it might be relationship success. It almost doesn't matter, because if you frame it as you're gonna see yourself living your best life, then it has two key things. One, they've already defined it as their best life. And secondly, what makes it quite interesting is they have this belief that it must be possible for them in some way because it's their same genetics, it's them living their best life. And typically I would do that with a third person disassociated. They observe it first, make the observations, learn it, take a first person perspective, activate the resource states, and then go back to the present with a plan of how to get closer to that version of themselves. That's very difficult to do if you don't have this kind of frame of infinite other realities. But if you do, and I found in every client where I've used this idea of parallel universes and multiple realities, infinite other realities, they get to that place quickly. And therefore that gives, for me at least, this kind of evidence of a frame that, well, if people can do that so easily, then it must be helpful. It must be because that imagination and the fourth dimension Venn diagram overlaps more than perhaps we think it does. Alternative realities don't have to be this idea of parallel universes, though. They can just be fictional universes. So if you think of things like the Marvel universe, the Harry Potter universe, I would have said for J.K. Rowling to write all of those books, how much time do you think she spent living in a different reality? You know, I think she was spending a lot of time actually living in this kind of alternative realities, and that's where the content came from. And again, you can look at this from a therapeutic perspective, but you can also look at it from how you harvest resources and ideas and inspiration. That actually, if you look at your imagination as a four-dimensional realm, and therefore it's infinite, there's things that you simply can't do in reality, but you can do in these other things. The important thing is to make it useful, and how do you harness that and bring it back? And I would say Einstein is a great example of someone doing something in his imagination that had real-world results. J.K. Rowling, a lot of time in her imagination in a different reality, but that led to, some of the best-selling books that we've had in the last, century. So these things can be quite helpful therapeutically, but also creatively as well. Dreams, lucid dreaming, guided meditation, it's all ways of kind of harnessing these alternative realities. So multiverses, I think, is quite a helpful kind of frame. These kind of alternative realities, I think I'm going backwards, that's why. Literally backwards through time. One final thought before this thought experiment I want you to leave you with is this idea of, in fourth dimension physics, you have something called wormholes. Wormholes is where you have, and they've actually been observed in the universe. They sound too crazy to be true, but they have observed them. And these are effectively things that take one part of a galaxy or a universe and link it to another. And if you think of the universe as almost like a fabric, it's almost like folding paper. So, for example, if I had a sheet of paper here, they're apart, but if I loop them around and touch them, actually two separate parts start to meet. That's the concept of a wormhole. What I want you to think about, though, is what if intense memories are wormholes to a different place in time? And you'll be familiar, I think, with something called flashbulb memory syndrome. Most people know where they were on 9/11, or they know where they were, let's say, if there was a high-profile assassination or when someone high-profile died. This kind of idea that we know where we were. Well, that's because we can link back to that place. And I would say intense memories could be a way of thinking about, well, you can easily get back to that place. And when you're in that place, then you can navigate everything around that place. There's a movie, again, not a great movie, but a great concept called The Butterfly Effect that kind of plays with this idea. It's an ironic title because the butterfly effect is actually about chaos theory. Actually, what the book's about is this idea of something else, which is kind of the cause and effect of different elements of time. But effectively, emotive memories that he could access through photos or journals took him back to a moment. And then if he made a change there, it rippled through to the present. And I think therapeutically, that's actually quite powerful. The way I frame that with my clients is that any intense memory, whether positive or negative, is a possibility of getting back to a different place in time. And therefore, that's an opportunity because most memories are not emotive. What you were doing on some random day at school where nothing happened, you can't ever get back to that day. There is no wormhole that takes you back to that. But if something major happened on that day and you've still got vivid emotions connected to it, then in fact, you can get back to that moment, if that makes sense. So again, this is just kind of a metaphor as to how we can use these things to kind of create change or implant suggestions. So I think we've got around about kind of 8 or 9 minutes left. So I'm going to end this with a thought experiment. And it's the thought experiment that I call the Tesseract. If you remember the pentacoron. It's a four-dimensional triangle. The tesseract is a four-dimensional cube. And the reason that I use a tesseract more than a pentacoron is that you could speak to a 7-year-old and they know what a straight line is, they know what a square is, they know what a cube is. So therefore you can get them to this idea of a tesseract. A lot of people don't know what a pentacoron is or a tetrahedron is, so it creates confusion. It's just not helpful. So if you are going to use these four-dimensional shapes as kind of like a stepping stone towards this idea of four dimensions, in my experience, a tesseract is the easiest of all of the shapes to do that with. Hopefully that makes